I trust you have your Bible with you this evening and then turn to the 13th division of the book of Romans, which reminds us that we're quickly getting toward the end of this book, only 16 chapters in the book of Romans as we continue this study, the textual study of this great essay of the Apostle Paul. Chapter 13 is where we are. It fits into the last major section of the book. This is our outline that we are following. The theme being, the just shall live by faith. Having spent 8 chapters developing justification by faith apart from the deeds of the law, he developed then this inner section, this parenthetical section concerning God has rejected the Jews and accepted the Gentiles. And then starting with chapter 12, last time we're dealing with the Christian and his relationships. In chapter 12, we saw the Christian and his relationship to his God, the Christian and his relationship to fellow Christians, his relationship to all men, and then even to his enemies. So everyone is included in chapter 12. We're ready for chapter 13, which deals with his relationship to the civil government. Now, that's not all that's mentioned in the chapter. There's more, as you will see in a moment. But in the flow of the concept of relationships, that's what he deals with in chapter 13. Then chapters 15 and 16, he deals with the relationship to the weak brother. That's not one who is weak, as in he's not very strong. In fact, he is very strong. It's a weak conscience. We'll talk about that next time in chapter 14. So here is what chapter 13 is about. Relationships to civil government and love and holiness. Those are the 3 subjects that are dealt with in chapter 13. I pick this verse, verse 1, as the summary verse to get to the heart of what the chapter's about, as I try to with each chapter. Verse 1 says, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God." That summarizes the relationship the Christian should have toward those in the civil government. So let's get underway looking at what the chapter develops. There are 3 sections to the chapters. I've already mentioned the civil government, the relationship to the civil government, 1 to 7. Then love is the supreme command, verses 8 through 10. And then there is a section on holiness, living pure. All of those really deal with relationships, and we'll try to thread those together as we get to those. Let's start with the relationship to the civil government. What is the Christian's relationship to the civil government? Well, there are some Christians who think that they would like to renounce civil government, have nothing to do with that, be off the grid somewhere, and we don't want to pay taxes, we don't want to do anything with reference to civil government because it is so corrupt. And that's not the picture that is given in the New Testament. There are numerous passages that make the same point that Romans 13 does. For example, Titus chapter 3 deals with this, 1 Peter chapter 2. We'll run over to 1 Peter 2 a little bit later in our study. But the point of verses 1 to 7 is we submit ourselves to civil government under every ordinance of man. The exception that is given is in Acts 5 and verse 29, and that is we ought to obey God rather than men. And so if civil government gives us a law we cannot obey and at the same time obey God, we must obey God. If they tell us we can't assemble and worship, then we're going to assemble and worship. Let them arrest us, let them do whatever, we're going to do what God tells us to do. If they tell us not to preach anymore in the name of Jesus, that happened in Acts chapter 5, 4 and 5, then we preach in the name of Jesus. We just do whatever has to be done. So let's look at the first thing that he develops here in this section. Here is our response to the government, and the response should be that we are subject to the governing authorities. We submit ourselves to the governing authorities. We submit to whatever they may tell us. We see this in verses 1 to 2, and then also verse 5. We skip verses 3 and 4 on purpose, and we'll come back to those in a moment. So let's start with verse 1. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. Now, why is it that we do that? Submit yourself. Here is your response. How am I, in my relationship to civil government, supposed to respond to them? Now, notice a little bit later, and we'll see the same thing in 1 Peter chapter 2. This is true whether we're talking about a king, we're talking about the national government, or we're talking about the state government, or we're talking about local government. You submit to the ordinance or the governing authorities. Now, reasons that are given for that is, first of all, they are appointed of God. Notice at verse 1, "For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God." What's he saying? He's saying God appointed civil government. Not that God appointed a certain form of civil government. Doesn't mean God established the monarchy or the democracy or the republic, whatever the case may be. Or that he appointed a certain leader. That is, he appointed this king, or that he appointed this president, or this senator, or this congressman, or this governor, or this mayor, or whatever the case may be. But God established that there be civil government. Whatever form it comes in. It may be a monarchy in some case, or it may be a democracy, or it may be a republic as we have. And so God has appointed there be civil government. Now let's just pause for a moment and think what it would be like without civil government. We have utter chaos. What are you going to do when you have a problem with someone? When someone is stolen from you? Well, the government is gone. It's not there to help you. What are you going to do when somebody you think is doing something they shouldn't be doing? Who are you going to call? You're not going to call the government. There's no police. There's nobody. They're not going to be arrested. They're not going to be put in jail because we have no civil government. We have utter chaos. We don't have any knowledge of who owns what property. You don't know what property is yours. You don't know which side of the street to drive on. You don't know if someone did you wrong by running into you if we have utter chaos. The second thing that he mentions, though, is in verse 2. The reason for submitting is to resist government is to resist God. Notice now at verse 2, he said, therefore whoever resists the authorities resists the ordinance of God. For those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. So why be submissive to civil government? You say they are corrupt. They are people who violate the laws themselves. That doesn't matter. God says they are appointed by Him that there be civil government, and to resist them is to resist God. I'm more worried about being in trouble with God than the civil government. They may arrest you, they may fine you, but I'm not so concerned about that as being in trouble with God. That's a little bit more weighty in the mind of the Christian. The third thing that he mentions is also in verse 2, to escape judgment. And so you're resisting God if you resist, and then you're going to face this in judgment. You rebel against government. You rebel against law. You just flaunt the law and say the law says this, and I'm not going to do that. I'm not interested in obeying. I'm not going to get caught. That's not the attitude of the faithful Christian. The fourth thing that he mentions is for conscience sake. We drop down to verse 5. And we skip 3 and 4 on purpose, and we're coming back to that in a moment. He says at verse 5, therefore you must be subject not only because of wrath, that is the wrath in judgment, mentioned earlier at verse 2, but because also of conscience sake. Now this is assuming that the Christian wants to do what's right and wants to live right. Your conscience should bother you when you violate the law. So what is my response to civil government? My relationship should be I'm going to be submissive to government with only one exception. Acts chapter 5 and verse 29. And I'm doing that because this has been ordained of God that there be civil government. To resist is to resist God. I'm going to face judgment over that. And furthermore, I'm interested in my conscience being what it should be. Now I know what the response. Let's talk about the role of civil government. We find this in verses 3 and 4. That's why we skip that, because it deals with a different point. So let's talk about the role of civil government. The role of civil government is they are a minister for good. Now, are there exceptions to that? Well, sure. There are forms of government, not just forms, but in any form of government, you're going to have corruption. But that doesn't mean that the government itself, the principle of government, is wrong. Let's look at verse 3. For the rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. That is, government within itself, if they are making laws and trying to govern the people, they are not a terror to those who are obedient and those who are good and those who are doing what's right. Generally speaking, there may be exceptions, but generally speaking, people who live right are not terrorized when they see a policeman coming or when they hear a new law that has been passed, because there are those who are submissive and obedient and those who do that which is right. They're not a terror to good works, but to evil. So do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Well, sure. Then do what is good and you'll have praise from the same. That is, you obey the law, you submit to the law. They're there for our good. It is for our protection. God designed that there be civil government. So now notice at verse 4, for he is God's minister to you for good. Civil government is pictured as a minister of God. Now let's pause and think about that just for a moment. How could the civil government be a minister of God? You say, the people we have in government are corrupt, they're ungodly, and you're right. But so were those in the first century. You take the kings, you take the Herods, you take even the Roman emperors, how corrupt they were, Nero or Domitian. They were those that were corrupt and they were ungodly. And yet they were the ones that Christians were to submit to. And still in this context called ministers of God. Let's go and just making a reference to, I'm not going to take the time to turn there, but Jeremiah 25:9 said Nebuchadnezzar was a man who was God's servant. Well, I thought he was a corrupt man. He was. He was not a Christian. He obviously was not a servant of God of the Old Testament times. He was not a man who served God. He was an enemy of God's people, and yet God used him as a tool. And so he was a servant of God in that sense. God uses him, and he's a minister of God. So is our civil government. Our republic is, or a democracy, or the monarchy is. Whatever the case may be, it's a minister or a tool of God. And so God, this is God's minister for good. For he does not bear the sword in vain. Capital punishment is what he's talking about. They execute, they don't bear the sword in vain. They use the sword. They have the right to use that sword. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on he who practices evil. So what have I learned about the role of civil government? They are a terror to those who do evil. They're ministers of God. They're tools of God. And they execute wrath on the evildoer. Now let's tie this into the context. You remember back in chapter 12 and in verse 19, the text says, do not give place to wrath. Or rather, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath. And we talked about how that when someone has done you wrong, rather than you take vengeance yourself, God says there is a place from which to execute wrath, and that's my seat. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Now, one of the tools that God uses to do that is found in this chapter. So you might tie verse 4 with chapter 12 and verse 19. God said, I will execute and I'll take care of that vengeance. One of the ways he does that is through civil government. Now, he'll ultimately do that in judgment. But what about this man who just killed one of my family members? Why don't I go and kill him myself? God said, no, that's not your place. You get out of the role. You get out of that seat. That's mine. Vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord. He'll take care of them in judgment. But maybe they're going to be executed by the civil government. And so they become a minister of God for good. So again, tie verse 4 back with chapter 19, or 12 and in verse 19. Now, let's notice the next thing that he mentions in 6 and 7 is the support of our government. Our response to the government, the role of the government, our support of the government. We pay taxes. Now, none of us like paying taxes. We might complain about taxes. We might complain about the high rate of taxes. This shouldn't be taxed. It shouldn't be taxed at that rate. We have every right to do that. We might vote to take down some taxes or take some taxes away. But what about the very concept of paying taxes? We want to pay taxes because God says this is how whatever form it comes in, is you support your government. Complain about their wasting of the money. That's fine. But we ought not to complain that we have to pay taxes because God says that's how they're supported. Look at verse 6. For because of this you also pay taxes. It may come in various forms. It may be a tribute. It may be, in our case, an income tax. It may be a sales tax. It may be a fee you have to pay. But you pay the taxes, for they are God's ministers. So they're corrupt and they waste. That's true. They're corrupt and they wasted. But they're tools of God that God ordained there be civil government. So you pay your taxes. For they are God's ministers attending continually to this very thing. What very thing? Well, they are God's ministers doing the job of verse 4 of executing wrath and maintaining order, etc. Now, verse 7, he says, render therefore to all their due. Taxes to whom taxes are due, custom to whom customs, fear to whom fear, and honor to whom honor. We'll come back to the honor in just a moment. What's he saying? He's saying here, render to all their dues. There may be a tax that's due. There may be a custom that's due. There may be a fee that's due. You pay your taxes, you pay your fees, you pay whatever comes your way. Now, vote as you wish or however you need to protest this particular thing being high, but we ought to be those who are willing to pay our taxes. You take all the taxes away, then we don't have civil government, and then we have chaos. Complain all we want, but God ordained that there be civil government. Now, I want us to notice one more thing on that section, our response to the government, the role of government, the support of government. Let's talk about our respect for the government officials. What about our respect for them? Well, notice at the end of verse 7 he said, fear to whom fear, and honor to whom honor. God teaches throughout the New Testament that there ought to be some respect and honor for the position and the office of those in civil government. Now, they may be corrupt. That's certainly true. They may be liars. They may be the kind of politicians that are dishonest. They may do a number of things that are contrary to the will of God, and yet God says honor them. I want to go to 1 Peter 2. I said we'd go there, so let's go over to 1 Peter chapter 2, and I want you to see and thread some connections together. 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning at verse 13, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. So you submit to the government. Well, who's in power? Well, Nero's in power now. As far as the emperor is concerned, well, you don't get much more corrupt than Nero unless it be Domitian. But Nero was pretty corrupt. He'd run a hard race against Domitian, I think. And so here is a corrupt emperor, but you are to submit yourself to their rule. Now let's drop down to verse 17. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God. Watch it. Honor the king. You mean Nero? Yeah, I mean Nero. Well, I thought he was corrupt. He is. But you honor the fact that he's the leader, he is the emperor, and you honor and respect that. I think sometimes we as the people of God, while we have disdain for the sin and the corruption that goes on in our government, we carry that disdain over so that we have little or no respect for the office that they hold. Doesn't matter whether it's Mr. Trump or Miss Harris or Mr. Biden. I should speak to Mr. Biden or about him with respect. He was our president. You say, oh, I didn't like him. That's not the question. He was Mr. Biden. He was Mr. President. He was one that was worthy of honor because he held the office. Same thing if Miss Harris had got there. Same thing with Mr. Trump. Same thing with whoever may be that may be corrupt. They're all corrupt. I'll give you that. But we need to show respect and honor rather than speaking of them with disdain as if we hate their guts. That should not be the child of God. Our respect should be that we have honor and respect for the office that they hold, and we honor the king like the text said. By the way, look back to 1 Peter chapter 2. The same king that you're to submit to, verse 13, is the same one you're to honor. Would anybody argue that, well, he's a corrupt president and he's dishonest, therefore I'm not going to submit to their laws. That's what I'm not going to do. I don't like the governor. He's dishonest, so therefore I'm not going to submit to state laws. I'm not going to do that. No, you would say, well, I don't care how corrupt they are, I have to obey them. You have to honor them too. Same context, same passage. Let's go back to Romans chapter 13. Now, having looked at the relationship to civil government, he shifts gears, it seems, but he's still talking about relationships because this is talking about love we have for one another. So we're still in the relationship section. And so does the holiness relate to that as well, by the way. But let's look at verses 8 to 10, that love is the supreme command. So he backs up, it seems, in talking about relationships, having focused on civil government. Let's back up and get a broader view that if we have love for one another, for other people, our relationships will be better. And it seems to focus primarily on our love for our brethren. So let's notice, first of all, at verse 8, that this is a debt that you will never fully pay. It seems that he feeds off of paying our debt of taxes. So at verse 7, render to all their due. There's going to be a debt of tax, and you're going to pay it. There's going to be a custom that's a debt, and you pay it. And so even having honor, that's a debt that you have to pay. And so with these debts that you pay, then here is a debt that you will never fully pay. Now let's take the tax, for example, back in verse 7. You're going to pay your tax, and if you pay it on an annual basis, when you've paid it, you said, I'm done. I'm not paying another cent. I'm fully paid. And that's great. Well, when you buy a house and you finally pay it off, that last payment, you said, I'm done. I don't owe another dime, and I'm not paying another dime. Same thing with your car, anything else you may buy. You buy some furniture on time and buy 90 days, same as cash. At the end of 90 days, you make the last payment. And I say, how much more are you going to pay? You said, not a dime. I'm done. I'm finished. Here is a debt that you can never say that about. And that's the debt that you have of love. You never say, you know what, I've done all the loving, I've shown all the love, and I'm done. I'm finished. I don't know another thing. You never pay this debt fully. So here's a couple of things I'm learning from verse 8. One is we ought to pay our debts, physical, financial debts. Owe no man anything but to love. Here is one that you'll never pay off and you'll always owe, and you'll never get it paid off. You just keep paying on it. You still have that obligation. You're going to keep paying. So it's a debt that you will never fully pay. And so have I done enough? Not yet. So I'm going to love some more. Have I done enough now? No, not yet. You keep paying. Are you done yet? No, I'm not done. Let's keep paying. You get the picture. Same verse, and tying with verse 9, this love fulfills the law. This is agape, by the way, that we've talked about recently. Owe no man anything but to love one another, for he who loves another has fulfilled the law. Now, what do you mean, Paul, that it fulfills the law? I take it this love for one another is love for brethren, though the principle would seem to apply to all men. And maybe that's the case because of the last two sections that he's dealt with. But be that as it may, look at verse 9. For the commandments, he illustrates it with the 10 commandments. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. That's just an illustration of the commandments. If there's any other commandment, they're all summed up in this saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So what's he saying? He's saying this fulfills the law. How does it fulfill the law? It fulfills the law in the sense that these other commands come under that. If you love your neighbor, you're not going to steal. If you love your neighbor, you're not going to covet. If you love your neighbor, you will not murder. And on down with any other commandment. So anything that has to do with the relationship to others, you'll do if you love. If you don't do it, you don't love. Comes under that command. It fulfills the law. So he's again dealing with relationships. In all relationships, there needs to be love for one another. This again is agape, not a warm, tender feeling. This is seeking the highest good for the recipient. Now let's talk about the characteristics found in verse 10. In verse 10 he says, love will not do no harm to its neighbor. And then he adds, again, the same principle, love is the fulfillment of the law. What characteristics does agape have? It doesn't want any harm. It wants only good. So this is the love you have for your brethren. That's true. This is also the love that we're going to have for the world. Our enemies that we just talked about in chapter 12. Even the civil government. That we should love those leaders. That we may detest the things they say and do. You still have love. And so it does not seek harm to them. And it fulfills the law. Well, how does that apply to the first 7 verses? Well, in the general sense that it applies to everybody, we've talked about in chapters 12 and 13. If there is love for the civil leaders, because you have to love all men, I'm going to be obedient because that's the command that I'm to obey. I'm going to pay my taxes because that's the command to obey. And on down the line, we might go. Now, let's go further now that I know love is the supreme command in all relationships. He talks about holiness in verses 11 to 14. Now, what's his point here? His point is that it's time to wake out of sleep and make our lives in harmony with the will of God. I don't think he's talking about becoming, it would apply to becoming Christians. But I think he's talking about to the Christian awaken out of sleep and dedicate your life to service and devotion unto God is his point. Be holy, set apart to the service of God. So let's start with this. Wake out of sleep, verse 11, he says. And you wake out of sleep knowing the time. And do this knowing the time. Well, what time is it? Well, I'm not asking, well, it's about 6:07. That's not the time. What time is it in your life? Now is the accepted time, 2 Corinthians 6 and in verse 2. Maybe 1 Peter 4 comes to play. We've wasted enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles, and so now it's time to start doing what's right. It may be knowing that Christ could come. It's time that maybe Christ could come. It could be that I could die. Knowing the time you're in. Knowing it's getting late. Knowing the time. It is high time to wake out of sleep, for our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. So what's his point? Awake out of sleep knowing the time because it passes swiftly. It's like someone coming into your bedroom and waking you up and saying, it's getting late, the time is passing, it's time to wake up and get on with the day. And what Paul is saying to them, it's time to wake up. It's time to get on with serving God. It's time to do what's right because time is passing swiftly. And know this, your eternal salvation is near. We flagged that this morning at verse 11, that what he's saying here is we're closer to eternity than we've ever been. You're closer to your death than you've ever been. It's never been this late before. It's never been this late in your life. You're closer to salvation. You're closer to heaven. You're closer to eternal damnation. You're closer to the judgment day than you've ever been in your life. That's why it's time to wake up and awake out of sleep. Now, in verses 12 and 13, he says, the night is far spent, the day is at hand. So it's a picture of waking up in the morning, and the night's far spent, the night's over, the day is dawning. Now it's time to get on with some things. So what do? You cast off, notice verse 12, the night is far spent, the day is at hand. Therefore cast off the works of darkness. It's the picture of like you're changing clothes. You take off filthy clothes and you throw them aside and you put on clean clothes. Well, the same thing is here. You're casting off darkness, casting off sin. In other words, put off sin. Look how late it's getting. It's time to put off any sin in our life because the day is at hand. So cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us walk properly as in the day, as in the daytime, the English Standard would say. So walk properly like in the day. People who are involved in sin, speaking maybe in the eyes of a criminal, they do that in the darkness of the night under cover so they can't be caught. Walk like you're walking in the broad daylight, where you're not unashamed of your action. You don't care who sees what. And so you walk properly as in the daytime. You're putting on the armor of light. Now notice at verse 13 now he said, let us walk properly, not in revelry, that is wild partying, boisterous kind of activity that shows rebellion, drunkenness, licentiousness, and lewdness, sensual things. And isn't it interesting that he mentions strife and envy? Look at that at the end of verse 13. Not in strife and envy. Now that's interesting to me from two vantage points. One is that he puts strife and envy in the same category of drunkenness and revelry and licentiousness. If I told you there's two bad guys here that you need to be aware of, this one's a drunkard and this one's envious, wouldn't you kind of think they're kind of out of category? And that's exactly what he just did here. He said, don't walk like in darkness, don't be in revelry, drunkenness, or in strife and in envy. Here's the other thing that fascinates me about that puts us back in the context of relationships. Drunkenness may not have so much to do with relationships. Licentiousness does. Revelry might, but strife and envy certainly does. So he's in the context from chapters 12 to 16 of relationships. And so love has everything to do with that. But so does this holiness. If you're going to be holy, you're going to cast off the works of darkness. That includes strife and envy. That's the contrast to the love found back in verses 8 through 10. Now, then he says, and finally at verse 14, put on the Lord Jesus and make no provisions for the flesh to fulfill its lust. So put on the Lord. What does it mean, put on the Lord? I don't think that's putting him on in baptism. Other passages talk about that. But this is talking about the child of God is to put on the Lord. Put him on in obedience, submissive to his will, doing what he says. And then notice he says, and make no provisions for the flesh to fulfill its lust. The New International, which is quite a free, eclectic kind of translation, but it renders this well. It says, don't think about how to gratify the desires of the flesh. So what's he saying? Well, do you put on the Lord Jesus Christ, but don't spend your time spinning your wheels thinking about how you can satisfy the desires of the flesh. Like we just mentioned right here. Don't spend time thinking, you know, I'd like to get drunk. I know I shouldn't. I'd like to be involved in licentiousness. I know I shouldn't. I'm envious and I'd like to get even and I know I shouldn't. Don't waste your time with that. Don't spend your time thinking about how I can fulfill the desires of the flesh. You're wasting your time. Put on the Lord. And so live holy. So what have we seen? We're going to give some practical things here in just a moment. But this is the Christian and his relationship to civil government. He's to be submissive and pay his taxes and honor and respect because they're God's ministers. Then he backs up and gets a broader view. We need to love our neighbor and our brethren particularly, and that fulfills all commands, and we need to be holy. And part of holiness is we put away strife and envy. That has to do with relationships. And we'll see even more about that in chapter 14. So here's some things that we just learned from Romans chapter 13, and so let's take these home with us. One is we are commanded to obey the law of the land. And so our attitude needs to be that here is the law that maybe it's a federal law, maybe it's a state law, maybe it's a city law, whatever the case may be. Rather than having disdain for that law because I don't like those that made the law and I don't like those that enforce the law. My attitude should be, I can obey that law. It doesn't violate the law of God, and God told me to obey those. I'm not obeying because I have respect for the king. I'm obeying because I have respect for God. There's a difference. Secondly, I learned from this that government is a minister of God. As corrupt as it is, the government is a minister of God. It's a tool of God. They're not Christians. They're not servants of God in that sense, but they are ministers of God. So I need to submit to them. I need to honor those to whom honor is due. I need to respect those who are officials in government. Have respect for the office they hold, just because they hold that office. I don't respect their lifestyle. I don't respect their hypocrisy, but they're in leadership. He's the mayor, she's the mayor, this is the governor, this is the senator, the congressman, whatever the case may be, the president. Respect them for who they are. And then I learned we ought to pay our debts. Not just our taxes, but pay your debts. In other words, there's no passage that says it's wrong to borrow money, but you pay that money back. You pay your debts. Owe no man anything but to love. And then, as we've mentioned 2 or 3 times, we're closer to eternity than we've ever been in our life. And that's the same tomorrow and the next day and on down through the rest of our life. Well, that's Romans 13. Chapter 14 is a different story. We shift gears again, and we'll give you a little heads up on that. That's going to deal with some very practical things, but then we're going to have to deal with some error that's been taught on Romans 14 that we need to be aware of. And so we'll talk about the misapplication of Romans 14, the proper application of Romans 14, and blend that in with some things in chapter 15 even later. But that's Romans chapter 13. There may be one or more present who's not a Christian, who's not a child of God. Would you come believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? Would you confess your acknowledgement of that faith and then be baptized in water for the remission of your sins? If you're subject in any way, would you come while together we stand and while we sing?